past few years, and there have been heated arguments about whether enhanced interrogation is a suitable method to get information from a small group of suspected terrorists. While we focus on this controversy, however, we are oblivious to a far more common and devastating form of torture that is used routinely in the justice system throughout Canada and the United States. Ashley Smith was a quiet child living in New Brunswick, Canada. However, her behavior became disruptive when she was a teenager. She was diagnosed with ADHD, learning disorder, borderline personality disorder, and narcissistic personality traits. As a result, she was involved in many violent incidents and entered the prison system. She was placed in solitary confinement for 27 months. Authorities say they placed her in segregation to protect her and other staff and inmates from her erratic, violent behavior. Ashley, who was already mentally ill, spiraled into extreme depression in solitary confinement and made multiple attempts to commit suicide. In 2007, the 19-year-old strangled herself to death. Ladies and gentlemen, Ashley Smith, along with thousands of others, was the victim of the most common form of torture, long-term solitary confinement. Many people are surprised to hear solitary confinement described as torture. When people think of it, it generally seems like one of the more benign things that happen to people in prison. It sounds like a time out. We imagine that if anything, it's a relief because it gives prisoners a chance to be separated from other inmates. Prisons all over the world use it as a form of punishment for breaches of prison discipline. Indeed, short-term incarceration doesn't do any harm, and it is a useful tool in the prison system. But the reality is that this confinement is not usually short-term, and that is where the problem lies. Inmates are held in segregation for long periods of time, and this has devastating consequences, so devastating that it has been recognized as a form of torture by international organizations such as the United Nations. So what is long-term solitary confinement? Long-term solitary confinement is the isolation of an inmate in a segregated cell for a prolonged period of time. Over half of all individuals in Canadian federal custody have been placed in solitary confinement at least once during their sentence, many for long periods of time. And over 80,000 men, women, and children are currently in solitary confinement across the United States. Solitary confinement has become a well-worn tool in the prison system toolbox. It's not being used sparingly as intended. Rather, it has become routine to resort to prolonged isolation during pretrial stages and for rule enforcement and protection. This has harmful moral and practical consequences. First, let's look at the moral. The psychological and mental consequences of solitary confinement are terrible. When an inmate is placed in segregation, they remain behind a solid steel door for 22 to 24 hours a day in a cold 6x8 cell with a steel bed and toilet. Their food is delivered through a slot in the door. Human contact is severely limited, and they're usually not allowed visits or calls with family members. As a result, they suffer permanent mental damage. In a study conducted by a former faculty member at Harvard Medical School, out of the hundreds of interviewed prisoners, over half were found to be actively psychotic or acutely suicidal. It was found that prolonged isolation could cause a specific psychiatric syndrome characterized by hallucinations, panic attacks, overt paranoia, diminished impulse control, and difficulties with thinking, concentration, and memory. Some inmates lose the ability to maintain a state of alertness, while others develop crippling obsessions. They are driven to take extreme actions. Inmates in solitary have been found to engage in self-mutilation at rates that are higher than the general prison population. Moreover, in one study of California's prison system, researchers found that from 1999 to 2004, inmates in solitary confinement accounted for nearly half of all suicides. After years of living in the cramped confines of a segregation cell with no hope of getting out, prisoners resort to self-harm and even death as a means of escape. So you might be wondering, why should we care? These are bad, dangerous people, and all of that is true. But there is a difference between punishment and torture. We would never accept waterboarding or the rack as a common discipline tool. But when we put inmates into solitary confinement, it is often even more harmful. Even those who would turn a blind eye to torturing ordinary prisoners, objectionable though it might be, would have to agree that subjecting those who are not responsible for their actions, such as the mentally ill, to torture, would be completely unacceptable. Yet that is exactly what we do. Over half of all inmates have a pre-existing mental illness, so that naturally makes them more likely to break prison rules and end up in confinement. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the worst thing that can happen to them because their mental condition suffers further. Subjecting mentally vulnerable people to things that break even the mentally healthy has devastating and sometimes fatal consequences. Subjecting not only the healthy but the sick to torture for things that they can't control is a moral abomination. Finally, it's not just the criminals we subject to solitary confinement. We also use it on the innocent, specifically those who are still awaiting trial. These individuals suffer the damage of isolation when they haven't even been proven guilty. And many times, they turn out not to have done anything at all. Khalif Browder was only 16 when he was arrested on false charges of robbery in New York. He was detained for 3 years, 2 of which he spent in solitary confinement. During his time in isolation, he made 6 suicide attempts. After he was released and his case was dismissed, Khalif was no longer the same person. He was consistently transferred in and out of a psychiatric ward due to the damage that he faced in the segregation cell. As a result of this damage and the trauma of it all, Khalif eventually hanged himself. Khalif is only one example of an individual whose life was ruined and prematurely ended because of the horrific after effects of solitary confinement, and he had done nothing wrong. Solitary confinement affects not only criminals, but also innocent people. But if the moral issues weren't sufficient, there's also the practical matter. The vast majority of prisoners are eventually released. As members of the public, it's in our interest, even if we don't care about the moral consequences, that when they are released, they're not a danger to society. But as the Harvard study showed, when we release an inmate back into society after they've spent years in solitary confinement, we essentially release them in a far more dangerous and volatile state of mind, and they're actually more likely to hurt others because now they're suffering from things such as hallucinations and a lack of impulse control. In a 2015 study of Texas inmates, it was found that over 60% of inmates released from isolation units were re-arrested within 3 years for reoffense. Long-term solitary confinement affects not only prisoners, but it also puts everyone else in danger. So what do we do? How do we deal with a routine procedure that has such significant moral and practical harms? One response would be to ban solitary confinement, and this is an understandable reaction. However, it is a mistaken one. Confinement is an essential tool to deal with inmates, and it works quite well when it's used properly. We don't need to ban solitary confinement. Rather, we need to regulate it. Solitary confinement is not devastating unless it is long-term. And once we realize this, ladies and gentlemen, the solution becomes quite obvious. First, we need to establish a code that limits both the length of any one period in solitary confinement and the total amount per year. This length must be determined by medical authorities to ensure that we're protecting the mental health of inmates. A typical model might be no more than 1 day at a time and no more than 30 days per year. This limit would force prison staff to use solitary confinement sparingly and as a last resort method. To ensure this, we need to deal with one more appalling aspect of prison mismanagement: inaccurate record keeping. Remarkably, in some cases, prisoners aren't in long-term solitary confinement deliberately, but because the people in charge forgot they were there. Record-keeping systems in prisons need to be made stricter, ensuring the time when prisoners enter and leave confinement is recorded. Second, there needs to be an assessment in place to ensure that we're not inflicting the damage of isolation on mentally ill inmates. Punishing sick people for being sick is immoral and counterproductive because it just makes them sicker. An assessment conducted by a psychiatrist would prevent this from happening. After all, what we should be doing with the mentally ill is not torturing them for things that they can't control, but treating them so that they can get better. Ladies and gentlemen, it's easy to ignore prisoners and think that they deserve what they get. But the fact is, nobody deserves to be tortured, especially those who are innocent or who are suffering from mental disorders. But this is exactly what we do. And we get away with it because, understandingly enough, there is no sympathy for prisoners. What we need to recognize, ladies and gentlemen, is that we would never take the step to cut off a prisoner's food or water as a form of punishment. But when we put them into solitary confinement for extended periods of time, it is every bit as harmful. If we abandon what is right in the search for safety, we will have neither. After the event in New Brunswick, people realized how wrong they were. They took a mentally ill girl and treated her in such a way that virtually guaranteed her death. People apologized, and apologies are fine, but they don't bring people back. It was too late for Ashley Smith, but it's not too late for the tens of thousands of others. Let us need no more apologies. Let us do what is right. Let us end long-term solitary confinement.
I don't intend being rude. Neither do I mean to be unnecessarily intimate this early on. But there's a question that needs asking nonetheless. I want to know exactly why I wasn't required to submit a urine sample at the beginning of this round of competition. If this World Individual Debating and Public Speaking Championship was a sports event rather than an academic one, I almost certainly would have been in line for some form of a drug test. If this was a sports event, the World Anti-Doping Agency would be here right now striving to create a level playing field. You see, I stand here knowing that there is a dose of some 500 nanograms of epinephrine coursing through my veins every second. In more familiar terms, my adrenaline is pumping. And as a result, my heart rate is up, and I am extremely focused on delivering this speech. Some may argue that I have chemical assistance in doing this, though my adrenaline is a naturally secreted hormone. But what if adrenaline wasn't the only chemical supplementing my efforts and raising my abilities? What if I had extra help in maintaining my focus, improving my memory, clearing my thoughts, and even calming my nerves? Would this be fair? Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the world of the study drug, the smart drug, methylphenidate. Methylphenidate is to the brain what steroids are to muscles. Steroids are banned in competitive sport, and today I am proposing that a similar environment apply to academics. Methylphenidate, commonly abbreviated to MHP, is a central nervous system stimulant and neural enhancer. It was developed specifically for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, with Ritalin being the first of many derivatives. It was released in 1950, having been proven a successful treatment for hyperactivity and narcolepsy. It was only recently, in 2007, that MHP was also identified as being a cognitive performance enhancer. Concerta, Adderall, and Strattera are today the best known brands of this drug. The way MHP works is it affects the prefrontal cortex dopamine receptor in the brain, subsequently improving working memory, concentration, problem-solving abilities, and overall inhibitory control. Ladies and gentlemen, I would be materially advantaged with just one of these few enhancements. Methylphenidate would be to me what meldonium is to Maria Sharapova. Well, up until 2 weeks ago, that is. Students studying longer and focusing harder are well known to universities around the world. The study drug has infiltrated campuses across our globe. Here in the US, in the UK, Australia, Germany, and back home in South Africa, colleges are seeing up to 35% of their students actively making use of this prescription drug to boost academic performance. Of relevance is the fact that 83% of these student users do not have a prescription themselves. They purchase their fix from a friend with a prescription who is selling his or her surplus medication. Now, if we take a deeper look at MHP, we start to understand that manufacturers never originally intended the drug for non-ADHD users. In fact, in most countries, the drug is legally classified in a group which includes cocaine and morphine. Here in the US, where we are seeing over 80% of global methylphenidate consumption, the drug is classified as a Schedule II controlled substance, defining that dealing of the drug or being in possession with intent to ingest or sell without a prescription exposes an individual to a fine of up to $5 million and a prison sentence of up to 20 years. It is clear that these non-prescription users and sellers are already in significant contravention of existing legislation. A second consequence, per se, is from a medical perspective. Being a Schedule II controlled substance, MHP is one of a group of drugs with the potential to be abused with possible harmful physical and psychological effects. Manufacturers have consistently reiterated that the use of this drug is specifically for patients diagnosed with attention deficit disorders. Abuse of MHP has been proven to cause seizures, insomnia, a reduced appetite, and an increased heart rate. In addition to creating an unfair advantage, as well as being illegal for some, these study drugs are potentially medically dangerous. But despite these harsh consequences, the demand for MHP continues completely unabated. But back to my original question. Is it fair? Is it fair that people enhance their cognitive abilities through the use of a drug when in a competitive academic environment? I propose an emphatic no. As long as there are people synthetically boosting their abilities whilst others choose not to take that same drug, then the playing field is most certainly not level. A level academic playing field can only exist when students compete against their peers at the same level of natural ability. The crux of this position is that of how do we create and sustain a fair but competitive academic environment? Do we look to abolish all use of methylphenidate? Or do we look to democratize its use completely? Well, neither. Those professionally diagnosed with attention deficit disorders justifiably benefit from the remedial effects of MHP. Abolishing all use of the drug will leave many genuine patients medically disadvantaged. Democratizing the drug too would also not acquire the desired equality. Legal, health, moral, and cost implications will always affect enough people so as to foster an unfair advantage for some. So it is clear that we need to go about solving this problem in a very different way. We need to look to align the already existing drug use regulations with a clear policy from academia. Now, to do this, I am proposing that educators and medical practitioners make use of a 4-point plan. Firstly, the diagnosis of attention deficit disorders needs to become more quantitative rather than subjective. After having spent 20 minutes on the internet researching some of the symptoms of ADHD, I confidently believe that I could motivate a prescription from even a relatively discerning doctor. More stringent consultations and prescriptions, as well as regular prescription renewals, would reduce the misuse of MHP. Secondly, upon consultation and being prescribed, those diagnosed need to be educated on the legal and health implications of non-prescribed individuals taking their drugs. Thirdly, universities, schools, academic institutions, and organizations, such as WIDPSC, need to take a stance on this matter. Whilst academia is well aware of methylphenidate and its use, only a few institutions have a stated position. Duke University is an exception, stating in their student code of conduct that the unauthorized use of prescription medication to enhance academic performance is punishable by expulsion. Other recognized institutions of learning need to establish and adopt a similar sentiment and thereafter publicly state it. My proposed fourth and final point is that these same colleges and academic institutions must implement random drug testing before or after tests, examinations, and competitions. Implementing this even on a small scale would create a major disincentive for non-prescribed individuals to take these drugs. Ladies and gentlemen, these collective 4 measures would at the same time be pragmatic and uninvasive. For the first time since 2007, there would be a clear collective policy on the increasingly contentious issue that is study drugs. You see, it's time for us to start recognizing that academic institutions are just as competitive as the sports fields, which are already appropriately regulated when it comes to doping. We need to acknowledge that academic contenders put in their all. First, to be accepted, then to pass, and finally, to excel. Tacitly permitting a neural performance enhancer without regulations and rules is tantamount to abolishing doping controls in that same sporting world. So, just as it is irrefutable that human beings are challenged on the sports fields only to the limits of their natural abilities, so too must academia establish protocols in testing the limits of the human brain. Not the human brain synthetically enhanced. Thank you.